Hello and welcome to the Franz van Cat interview. I'm Annette Young. This week we've been flooded with images, tales and recollections of that fateful day on September 11th, 2001. While the images themselves are riveting, it's perhaps the printed word that captured the visceral reaction that we felt to those extraordinary events. Journalist and author William Longevischer published one of the first definitive texts in the wake of 9/11. Entitled American Ground, Building the World Trade Center, it's an insider's account of the cleanup of the Twin Towers, where the author was given the permission to cover all aspects of the demolition process. His book has just been now published in French, and William is now the international correspondent for Vanity Fair, who also happens to be here with me in the studio today. William Longevischer, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Your book was based on a series of articles that you wrote for the Atlantic Monthly. Why did you decide to focus simply on the process of cleanup and demolition as such?
Well, you have to focus on something, and I mean, we felt at the Atlantic that process, especially in the context of New York, the most intense city in the world in some ways, certainly in terms of real estate and neurotics, was going to be very complicated and inherently interesting. So I was interested, as always, not in talking in generalities about the situation, but talking in specifics. Of course, going in there, we had no idea what was going to happen. Was it going to be a huge fiasco? And it turned out to be an unusual experience for everyone involved, and far from a fiasco, a huge success.
Was it difficult to sort of focus merely on that process, given every other issue that was then sort of clamouring for our attention at the time?
Well, I was one man dealing with this enormous project 7 days a week for 6 months. It was difficult to focus within the project. Unfortunately, I was not able to pay much attention to what was going on outside of the project or matters unrelated to the cleanup of the World Trade Center. So we know what was happening in the United States, the lockstep unanimity, which was a very dangerous thing, the overreactions, the building of security bureaucracies, and of course the launching of a war in Afghanistan, which very quickly turned wrong, and then the completely needless war in Iraq, where, as you know, I then spent quite a few years. That was not on my horizons. It should have been, looking back, of course. It was really the important events, but I had my own focus. And what I was looking at was really quite the opposite of what was happening elsewhere in the United States. I mean, it was affected by some of the maudlin emotionalism, some of the unnecessary and artificial hero worship that was going on.
And your book has been accused of being, I mean, I know this is a book that's been published 9 years ago, and in fact you're saying it's been a long time since you've sort of been forced to turn around and think about it, but it's been accused of being rather dispassionate, rather forensic in its approach.
Well, if it is, I'm quite proud of that. I think there needed at the time to be a lot more of that. In fact, if you look at some of the great failings of the American media at the time, is that there weren't other writers and reporters who were, that I know of at least, who were taking that approach. It was all about tragedy. It was the publicizing of tragedy. Now, tragedy was real, but the tragedy was real only for the close friends and families of the 3,000 roughly people who died. The rest of it is a kind of a public wallowing for various reasons. Political, media, it translates well on television. It apparently translates well into the New York Times. And I don't believe that it was entirely cynical. I mean, I think that these reporters were just absolutely shocked. Why? Because they were babes in the woods.
And you talked about that in your book, about going down there and it's feeling the sort of experiences that you weren't used to feeling in New York. I mean, there's sort of experiences that you've felt in other places, war zones, places of difficulty, and perhaps that's part of it as well, is that...
When I first went in, there was no shock to me. When I first went in, it was a feeling of, surprisingly, familiarity. That was my number one reaction, with all the smoke and the dust and the people scrambling.
And the chaos.
And the chaos and the way the ground, the rubble felt. You know what it's like, crunching under your foot. It makes a certain sound when basically concrete is pulverized. It just was like a lot of places I've known in the world, and it just, well, it was in New York, and I didn't think that New York is, an inherently more sacred place than any other place visited by war. I mean, I think all places are equally sacred in that sense, and they should not be visited by war. I didn't think New York was so special in that sense, so I was not particularly shocked.
Many would say that this is a case of two buildings which so much represented the American dream, and their subsequent destruction is very much a metaphor for current American society. Is that something you would agree with?
No, and there are various reasons for it. But even if we accept those buildings as a metaphor for, symbol of America, they were destroyed from the outside, and the destruction going on in the United States since is from the inside. No one is hitting us in the same way. We're doing this to ourselves. And of course, the sad part is that we could blame it on a particularly incompetent president at the time of 9/11, surrounded by reactionary advisors. But now we have a very competent president surrounded by non-reactionary advisors, and we're basically following the same policies. There's no standing down. So it doesn't seem to be the politicians. We can't really blame it on Washington. It seems to be an organic, self-destructive impulse by the United States. And of course, that's not what took down those towers.
So do you think that's a sentiment which is particularly American, or would it be found elsewhere in the world?
I think different countries would react in different ways. I don't think it's particularly American, but I think the United States at this point in its history is showing itself to be in that category of countries that react to trauma by eating themselves. Other countries now certainly would be more resilient. Which country would act in which way is a professor's game. I don't know, but I'm sure there are differences in the way countries react. I mean, just take the case of the UK during World War II. You want to find a country that was extremely resilient. How England would react now, I don't know. Maybe England has changed. I don't know. But I know that the United States is proving itself to be not very resilient. And the problem is not Al-Qaeda. The problem lies within us.
Do you think America is still way too hung up on the events of that day?
Absolutely. I mean, especially if you take into account that such events as are going on this weekend, with a lot of memorializing, public wallowing in this, a lot of dredged up emotionalism, public emotionalism. Again, I'm not denying the real emotions, legitimate, terrible sorrow of the people who lost people in those towers.
You just want to put it into perspective. Is that what you're...
And there's also the perspective. I mean, the perspective is that all war is tragic. It's terrible when 3,000 people die. It's even terrible when 3,000 soldiers in uniform die, because most of them really were probably drafted. So the distinction that it's okay for soldiers to die but not for civilians to die, well, I don't quite understand that in reality, okay? It's terrible when 3,000 people die violently and early in a war. It was terrible in New York, and it's terrible in the Middle East, and it's been terrible all over the world. It was really terrible in Vietnam.
But just coming back to your own experiences, you have also professionally and personally lived through the aftermath of all this by covering the war in Iraq, haven't you?
Right, and elsewhere. But also I was in war zones before, so okay, sure.
Did 9/11 paralyse the country's ability for self-reflection, and therefore what did it do in terms of creative expression there?
Well, self-reflection, I think what is the United States? I mean, certainly there are plenty of intelligent voices now in the United States exhibiting self-reflection, and not just the knee-jerk left-wing stuff. Overall, I think the United States clearly is probably not, to the extent that the policies we're pursuing are popular, and again, they're really maybe not that popular. To the extent that they are popular, there's not much self-reflection evident there. So which United States? The elites, the middle of the country, the uneducated, the educated? The United States is many things. As far as creative expression on this particular subject, I guess it's hard for, let's say, I'm not sure what the creative expression is, but a really good movie to be made, or a really good novel, or a really good piece of poetry. I'm not sure that it's possible for that to happen in the context still of something akin to public hysteria. I mean, how...
Do we need another generation or so before we can...
Well, I would like to say we need another 10 years. I mean, if we're lucky, we can pull out of this. Maybe it could happen tomorrow. Maybe they only need one 10th anniversary and we can move on. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen.
Just finally, William, how much has the country changed since September 11th, 2001?
Of course, enormously, enormously. And, you know, at the time, I was thinking about it today, there was this line that went around, you know, we've lost our innocence forever. Well, that's not the problem. What innocence, first of all? I mean, that was a ridiculous thing. It was widely said. I don't know if you remember this. But, of course, the United States has fundamentally changed in the sort of mass and somewhat cowardly pursuit of safety at all costs. I mean, we are not originally, we're not a cowardly nation. We were many things, but cowardly, no. This has essentially been a cowardly reaction, and I hope it's temporary. I'm not talking about, you know, defining courage by going out and bashing heads. I'm talking about defining courage by the old-fashioned stiff upper lip, the willingness to take the hit and hit back, if necessary, in an intelligent way. But take the hit and move on. Stop moaning about it.
William Longovich, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the Franz van Kat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up shortly.